Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is going to be the FHIR Meets Corporate Security session. It is 11:45 Eastern, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We will let Lucas get his screen up and running. Just so that you know, there is no chat or Q&A function in the Zoom platform. You do need to use the Q&A and chat functions in Whova for this session. The session is being recorded and will be uploaded within 24 hours. If there are extra questions and we are out of time, Lucas will be monitoring them throughout the week. So Lucas, let me know when you're ready and we'll get going.
I am ready as I can be, so let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, it's recording already, so
all right, perfect. Hi everyone, Lucas is here. Hope everyone is doing well. I'm excited to have everyone here, whether it's good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I know we're all over the place. I, for once, couldn't be in person. Fortunately, there is an option to be telepresent. So here we are. We're going to talk a little bit about, quickly about the FHIR meets corporate security. So like I said, my name is Lukasz Nosol. I am currently working as a Senior Director of Software Engineering at Optum Technology, where I lead a lot of different initiatives around interoperability. And what we're going to talk today is a couple of findings that we have seen, that I have seen from the field, talking to other industry experts, as far as, how is it that how FHIR meets real life solutions when that person from enterprise information security shows up and says, hey, you should do this on top of your FHIR specification. With that, let's go ahead and jump in. One more time, currently I'm employed at Optum, where I lead development and architecture for the interoperability patient access services platform that Optum is building. I am also currently sitting on the advisory council with Care Quality and pretty active as a co-lead of the Da Vinci architecture group. So, a lot of things that I do are revolving around interoperability, very passionate about it. And that's why I put this slide deck together so we can, have a little live check, how is it really, how FHIR functions in the real world, how things are looking, and what are the things that we usually have to take care when we're meeting EIS or information security from different organizations. So, we only have 15 minutes or so. We'll try to leave a minute or two at the end for questions. I'll see if there's any questions by the end, and I will try to address them if we have time. But I try to pick really, some representative examples. There's no shortage of examples, but in a short amount of time, I picked 3 examples, so 3-4 minutes per example. The first one that I would like to talk through is what I call the CDS hooks dilemma. It's a pretty peculiar one, and it may not be, something that you normally think about until you have a person with a press suit talk to you from information security, say, hey, by the way, we can do it this way. Second topic is what I refer to as sensitivity of patient ID. Very interesting one that we have seen in the field. And then last but not least would be our forensic data tracking. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is and how one can address it in the field. So let's let it rip with CDS hooks dilemma. So I'll quickly recap maybe what CDS hooks are. I think for the most part, many of you would understand how CDS hooks work. I know there was a session today, and hopefully this will be just a quick recap of how CDS hook works, and I'll highlight where's the challenge. So in a regular hook, CDS hook workflow, an EHR, which in this case would be a CDS client, would make a request to CDS service, triggering some action. Sometimes it will give us the data. Sometimes the CDS service would have to do that middle FHIR query here, expecting a response, and then perform an action, some kind of a logic, and then responding with any of the cards. And everything looks great on paper, but when this corporate security person talks to you, you have to make sure that you authenticate both sides. So a lot of times CDS services are secured with TLS, which is great because it authenticates your your server. It also encrypts data over the wire. However, how do you authenticate the CDS client that talks to you? And what happens, usually, sometimes people use mutual authentication or you use the JOT token. What's very, very interesting is when you meet a use case that mutual authentication is not feasible, that means you have to refer to JOT token or that comes on the CDS header, and then your CDS service has to forever request every CDS hook and whatnot discover call, that CDS service has to go ahead and read the certificate that the JOT token was created and signed with a private key on the client side. So that, on paper that looks great, but what happens when your CDS client gets deployed behind the gateway? That creates very interesting dynamics, because what happens is any data that leaves from a client is free to go, even with firewall, everything going out, that's great. The FHIR request for data from a CDS service, when it comes back even to the server, that works well because there's usually a token that was given to you in the CDS hook. But what happens when you want to verify this JOT token that was sent here? Per specification, you would go and read your public key, your certificate from a CDS client, but oh, wait a second, there's a gateway here. Everything has to go through a gateway. And that was an interesting moment that we have seen in the field. It's like, oh, wait a second, I can't just, everything that the CDS client exposes has to be authenticated. So I no longer can I go and just get the certificate. CDS service cannot just get a certificate like that. So what are our options? You obviously have to authenticate. So CDS client now has to authenticate you as a CDS service. And again, there's multiple ways to solve it. One of the options is to just use another client ID and a password. Is it ideal? Probably not, because you have to manage it and store it on your CDS service. The other option that you can potentially take is to leverage the access token from the CDS hook that came in here, just like that token is being used to FHIR queries. The same way you can potentially use it to retrieve the certificate. Again, just to highlight, we have just a couple minutes. This was just to highlight that taking CDS spec off the shelf and applying it when you start talking to enterprise security, you may find issues like that you will have to solve it for yourself. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is the sensitivity of patient ID. So this is a use case that I have seen in the field where on the right-hand side on your FHIR server, data by a client is stored in a FHIR server, and the real patient ID, in this case, is 1234, right? But we are not allowed to expose this data externally. We won't dive into why, but let's say this is a requirement from our friends at Enterprise Security. They say, hey, this data is critical. We cannot. You have to assign something different. So what that means that when you, as a client, when you call a patient, you will never see this 1234 logical patient ID. You will see something obscured, like in this case, it's a 789. So let's see, how can we do this? Because there's multiple ways to do it, and some of this will obviously depend on how your architecture looks behind the scene. So for those of you who have created or work with the FHIR servers, like actually creating FHIR servers, not necessarily using them, but actually creating them, your solution will probably depend on the way your FHIR server works. So for those of you who are familiar, there's two major patterns a FHIR server can be constructed. It's either a FHIR repository where data gets stored in a FHIR server, and the other one is what we refer to as a FHIR facade, where that FHIR server itself doesn't store the data, but it delegates the, data lookups to somewhere else. So I'll walk quickly through some of those. So for FHIR repository, this is the case where your data gets stored in a server. You'll see as this data needs to be pumped to the FHIR server. So on the corporate side here, on the right-hand side, this patient data, when it comes in this, real ID, but it needs to be obfuscated to something different. How you obfuscate it, again, we won't dive into. There's multiple ways to do it. There's some proprietary solutions. How the idea is that you convert it one way from 1, 2, 3, 4 to 7, 8, 9. You most likely don't have to keep track of it because once it gets in the server, you have it in there. Your patient ID gets persisted with a different value. And from then, your solution is back in business. The client can just request that patient by that external ID, or if you do without the logical ID, if you get all the patients, the logical IDs will be the way they have been persisted in the server. Well, how does it look for the FHIR facade? For the FHIR facade, it's a slightly different problem, and it's more intricate, if you will, because the FHIR server in the FHIR facade, it doesn't, store the data on its own. So it's data agnostic, if you will. It doesn't persist the data. It needs to look up data somewhere. Sometimes it's multiple systems, and it's very popular in the corporate setting where you have multiple systems you have to go to, especially in large enterprises. So what would happen here is the internal non-FHIR system that stores your patient, it has the patient with a real ID. When a request comes in, or for that patient, what will have to happen, your FHIR server has to maintain the mapping between your real ID and then the fake ID, the not a real ID, if you will. And this is critical. This is very interesting. There are some servers out there that can do it out of the box. It's not easy because you cannot ever lose this information. So this is critical. That mapping is critical for those patient IDs to be persisted, because once you dish it out to your clients, they will come back and ask for this data later, whether it's on a patient medication. So you need to be able to say, oh, this 7 and 9, that was for patient 1, 2, 3, 4. If you ever lose it, there may be ways that you can create it, but there may be not. So it really depends on your use case. So very different ways of addressing the sensitivity of patient ID, but the overall goal is to not show the real patient ID. And again, this may be coming from your friends at Enterprise Information Security teams. Okay, let's move on to the next one, what I refer to as forensic data tracking. It's a fancy name, but the idea is fairly straightforward. What happens when your data is being found somewhere, and we need to understand where did it originate from, who did we give it to? We need to understand a little bit about, let's say, FHIR resource was found somewhere in the field, and the forensic team would like to understand, like, okay, well, who did we initially give it to? There's nothing in the FHIR spec that I've seen that allows us to do it other than this custom solution to provide what I call a tracker. And you can think of a tracker as kind of like when, large amounts of money are being transferred in those bundles of money. Sometimes there's a GPS tracker being put in some of those bundles in a big bag. So you don't know where it is, but it might be there. So this is a very similar idea. So it's a little bit security by obscurity, but it gives you a bit of an edge over an attacker or adversary, if you will, to be able to find this. So again, the idea is to input that tracker. Now, what do you have to consider? Again, this is all driven by your enterprise security. They say, hey, we need to be able to determine that this data was given to Lucas's application and maybe on what day. So that means you have to put this data in the tracker. Now, what do you put in the tracker will depend on what your requirements are. Is it only for whom it was the data was exported, when, where, and how much? It depends. It will really depend on number of the use cases that your enterprise security will give you. And then you have to build it and you add it to the resource, stuck it in there. Then you have two ways of storing it. You can either take that tracker, hash it, or encrypt it. Again, none is perfect because when you hash it, you just get a blob, fixed length, but you need to be able to resolve it. So you will need to have something internal in your system to be able to ever look it up, how to actually do it. So if there was some kind of analysis, you look at the hash, oh, let me look at the system where the hashes are, let me figure this out. Or you can encrypt it. So then you don't have to store it internally, but the data is encrypted within your payload. What will happen though, this can bloat your data a little bit. And then what you also have to worry is, you really have to worry about the key to decrypt this information, right? Do you maintain all the keys? Do you care? Do you just keep one? It's not really, easy. Again, it will depend on your use cases. And then last but not least, you have to judge for yourself, or you have to help your business determine the cost versus benefit. It's not a foolproof method, right? There's not a golden bullet that will solve your problem when the data gets found somewhere. You'll be able to do it. It's kind of a cost versus benefit, right? You may need to put a lot of effort, or why don't you just get a library that can do it for you? Maybe that's your solution, right? So you have to work it out with your business and be able to determine where do you want to take this, how much value it is. Because ultimately what happens is, if this data gets injected with your tracker, what can happen is, if someone knows where the tracker is, what do? Just like they do with the GPS tracker that is in a bundle of money. You take it, toss it out of the window, and you drive off. It's going to be the same case here. So you really have to be very careful and really work with your business partners to be able to do it right. Determine, what data do you track? How deep do you want to go? How you kind of inject it, where you inject it, whether you hash it versus encrypt it, or you encrypt it, and again, do you get the bang for your buck for the data, for the value of the development. With that, I think we powered through the slides. It was just about over 15 minutes, so right on time. If you have any other questions about this, feel free to email me, lukasz.nosol@uhc.com. You can also ping me on LinkedIn. I monitor my account frequently, so I'll be happy to chat with anyone who's interested in, or maybe they have some of their own insight. I'll be more than happy to touch base and discuss it. So with that, we'll just pause here, and we'll see if there's any Q&As from the audience.
You do have a few, Lucas. Do you want me to read them to you?
Sure. I don't see them for some reason. So let's if you can read them,
Sometimes you have to
that'd be
refresh,
great.
but I'll go ahead and read it to you. So
Okay.
One question is FHIR/FHIR server built or enabled to comply with HIPAA and HITRUST?
Well, it will depend on the vendor. So let me go back to some of my pictures. So it depends on the vendor. Every vendor would. This is not really related to the corporate security topic here, but if the question is whether FHIR servers are HIPAA compliant, that will depend on the vendor. So whoever asked the question, you will have to work with your vendor and see if your FHIR server is HIPAA compliant. If you're working on a server for a healthcare company or a provider, they will likely have to abide by the rules of HIPAA. If you work for a third party, maybe like someone who pulls data from payer that is not, then you may be okay not using a HIPAA compliant solution. However, you're still under FTC regulation for any type of data breaches. However, you wouldn't be under the HIPAA regulation.
Okay, the next question is, did you consider the provenance or audit edit resource for the forensic data tracking?
You can. We look at number of options. I'm not going to disclose how we did ours, but we did look. The idea was to really just to kind of hide it, because we wanted to be kind of a thumbprint type of information that is out there for the clients that we work with. But you could potentially on depending on your solution. Okay. Any other questions?
There's a longer question here. Does Smart on FHIR make any recommendations for an EHR launching into an app, but where the FHIR API supported by the EHR is limited, e.g. Cerner Ignite, which has serious limitations on things like searching for FHIR resources? Is it possible to launch into an app that uses a different FHIR server than the EHR's native implementation? And are there any best practices for dealing with limited FHIR API?
Oh, that's a really long question. Again, probably not super related, but it's a good question. So let me see if I can maybe address it offline. I need to read it and reread it to make sure I give the right answer.
Sure. And
so
that
I
one
think that'd be the
actually
best way
showed
to
up
address
in
it.
the chat function, just so you know.
Oh, okay.
It's not in the regular Q&A. So
okay, so if whoever did that, if you could submit it through the Whova app, because that's what I'll look for questions, then I'll be able to address it.
Sure. Okay, I think that is all we have right now and all we have time for at the moment. So,
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Appreciate your patience and thank you for the support.
Yes, thank you for an excellent presentation, Lucas, and thank you to everyone who attended. And just as a reminder, we will be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have any other questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A box. And we will be posting the video within 24 hours.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye all.
Have a wonderful day.